Hi, and welcome back to another episode of the Real Return Show. Today, we're joined by Professor Michael Boskin. Professor Boskin is a professor of economics at the Department of Economics at Stanford University, and he's also a fellow at the Hoover Institution. In addition, he has a very noteworthy career in public service, chairing the Council of Economic Advisors under President George H.W. Bush. Thank you so much, Professor Boskin, for joining us today.
My pleasure, John.
So our first question kind of has to do with that intro that I just talked about. So you spent much of your career moving between academic research and public policy. So I'm curious as to what kind of first drew you, or what sort of questions first drew you to economics and economic research, and when you kind of first maybe thought that your questions had a scope beyond the classroom.
I think that's something that emerged gradually. I started my undergraduate career pre-med, but I soon became very bored with the courses. And then I wandered into my sophomore year, an introductory economics course, which I had probably the most boring professor I had in college, but the material was fascinated me. Just how the economy worked, how different policy issues emerged about can we promote growth? Can we stabilize the economy against recession and inflation? Can we improve the allocation of resources? Can we deal with external issues like pollution and congestion, et cetera? All those things interested me, so I saw it as a huge field that had numerous avenues where you could help people en masse a little bit rather than one at a time as a doctor. So that really appealed to me. So I've always been very interested in how policies both affect the economy and can, when properly designed and implemented and avoiding too much political politicization, can actually do a fair amount of good. But I also eventually became aware that they can be manipulated and do wind up doing harm. So just like the medical profession has the Hippocratic Oath, I often had to kind of reimpose that on policy as I was trying to either design it or implement it or be responsible to oversight or indeed prevent bad policies from being implemented.
And I think maybe starting on kind of your academic career before getting into some of like your policy work, your early research examined things like taxes and how it affects variables like saving and investment. And you later helped, develop ideas that kind of influenced like Reagan-era tax reform and things like that. But I think like, tax issues still remain a very kind of contested issue today, right? Like, I mean, in I think 2025, after I think in 2017 there were those initial tax cuts and they were kind of made permanent in 2025. So I'm kind of curious about what economists, understand about taxes and incentives more academically that policymakers then you think often miss. And do you think again that those lessons are still kind of being missed or relevant to today?
Well, I think that there are many. I would not underestimate politicians' either ignorance of or desire to ignore the laws of economics and indeed the laws of arithmetic at times. They don't worry about that too much. I'll give some examples perhaps later on in our discussion. But there are some basic laws of economics, and for example, demand curves slope downward and things of this sort. And there are some basic facts, for example, about the misallocation of resources, that the harm from higher tax rates goes up with the square of the tax rates. So doubling the tax rate quadruples the resource misallocation. That's not an ideological issue. There may be ideological arguments about higher or lower taxes, but they're not based on this simple fact, because that has to do with the area under demand and supply curves. Okay, it's basically a technical issue. And so that immediately tells you that you should be wary of tax rates getting too high, especially when they're high on activities that are very responsive to taxes. Some things are less responsive, some are more responsive. Um, for example, if we're taxed at 100%, most of us wouldn't work. I might still do that because I love what I do, but most people, in a mine or a factory, or with kids at home are going to say, well, if I'm not going to net any wages, why bother to work? So we know at some point the taxes become strongly disincentivizing to productive activity. And so the arguments really are around more about trade-offs in what effects people think are important, distribution versus growth, for example, and how that affects various groups, including across generations, not just within a static income distribution, and how high the effective responses, what we call elasticities in economics, are. Um, I became associated with the beginnings of what came to be called supply side economics with my work on taxation of saving. And it was kind of shocking that people found that the very fairly modest effects that I found were considered too large or revolutionary because they were not consistent with simple Keynesian theory that the marginal rates don't matter. It was the aggregate size of the taxes. The composition, for example, between taxes on investment or taxes on saving, taxes on work versus taxes on consumption, for example, didn't matter. And I think very few serious economists debate that anymore. We still debate about the size of these effects. But I think even the OECD, which is not exactly a small government, limited government organization, has concluded that taxes on capital and saving and investment are the most harmful to growth. Income taxes, for example, corporate income taxes, and consumption taxes the least harmful.
And then I think you kind of mentioned some of like the aggregate effects or the effects like beyond like the surface of like the initial like tax rates that you see. And you also talked a little bit about like your association with like the supply side economics. So I'm wondering if you can kind of explain the whole, like trickle down concept and how that kind of relates to any of your work in tax rates as well.
Yeah, I think trickle down is an unfortunate acronym that the political left ascribes to a good idea. But it's fair to say that some adherents of supply side economics exaggerate the effects, thinking that every tax cut pays for itself. Well, if you reduce taxes on something, you'll get more of it. But we tax income, not the tax. We don't tax the tax base. We tax income. We don't tax revenue. So you'd have to have the revenue elasticity of the tax base be greater than one in order to have that effect. Well, on some things, probably really high taxes on capital gains, which people can defer, and for example, or on people at times in their career or in their situation where they're very responsive to work incentives, maybe because they have lots of transfer payments they could take instead on the lower end, or they have opportunities to shield by moving into fringe benefits at the higher end. Those things probably have reasonably high elasticities. Cigarette consumption does not. So, if we cut the cigarette tax in half, we're not going to get the same or more revenue because people aren't going to smoke twice as many cigarettes. Okay. So you have to figure out what these different effects are. I find that there's a lot of confusion. It's one of the areas with a lot of confusion about these things on Capitol Hill and among elected leaders. Um, and there's reason for debate. There are often many studies, and some come to different conclusions. Um, I tend to believe something at least is more than a brief flash holding in my brain, but it's something that I hold until I see better evidence. When it's reproduced in various studies with different techniques on different time periods, perhaps in different countries, if there's some reason that it could be analogous. Um, so I tend to have a fairly high standard for that. And I think the evidence still reveals that taxes on saving and investment are especially when they get pretty high, can be pretty damaging to the performance of the economy. And that's bad. It, however, tends to be bad over the longer term for capital formation, growth, higher productivity, and higher future wages for people who are younger now, who aren't in the labor force for future generations. So I think they tend to be, along with public debt, an area where it's intergenerationally inequitable. So I tend to believe that we have to have, um, we should harmonize. We have many of these now, but when I started out and when I was advising then candidate Reagan, he loved my idea of IRAs, individual retirement accounts, and expanding 401k accounts, which reduced the double taxation of saving to single taxation. Right now, if you do ordinary saving, you tax when you earn as part of your wages. and they tax again when you earn as capital gains or interest or dividends. And so reducing that and unifying that, I think still remains a priority. But there are many more vehicles doing that now. It's typical of the political process. They deal with these one at a time. They're named for particular politicians to promote them. So if they add a new program rather than make the existing program more general. So, but in any event, I think that's been one of the areas where tax policy has improved. Another area that shouldn't be underestimated is many elected officials have had limited interaction with, if not outright hostility toward markets and markets as an efficient allocation mechanism. When I was helping put emissions trading into the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, I would go up to Capitol Hill and I had several senators ask me, what makes me think that a market would work? So having won teaching awards, I go through the history of the development of formal markets after informal markets, development of capitalism, development. I went to, you know, when stock markets developed and et cetera, when insurance developed, how these markets arose from human needs and a market was able to provide a good or service. And that still seemed to be beyond them. Maybe they hadn't taken an econ course, maybe they were just busy doing other things, or maybe they're just hostile to the idea. But we put it in, and the ex post analysis revealed that it reduced the cost of compliance for the Clean Air Act amendments for SOx and NOx and et cetera, by over 50%. So I think that was a clear example where it worked. So those are examples. It's also the case that spending any time in the government should disabuse an academic of the bias that their latest research should prevail on public policy, unfiltered by or untested by others, et cetera. And it should also disabuse them of the notion that anything they propose is likely to be adopted cleanly, but rather go through what's often called the sausage making of legislation. And it's not just legislation, because there are many links in the chain. Some academic gets an idea, whether that's me or you in the future or somebody else, and they make a proposal. And then it gets put into the policy process, someone running for president or someone in the House or Senate, if it's taxes on the Ways and Means or Finance Committee, picks up the idea, and then they write, the legislation's written up by lawyers. It goes through legislative compromises. It may pass. And then, of course, the regulations that have to be written and how it's enforced. And their courts just, people file lawsuits and the courts adjudicate how it is. So how it actually gets implemented in the real world has many potential points of slippage. And so keeping those to a minimum becomes a big part of what economists do, and keeping bad ideas out. One of the greatest economists of the last century, the late Kenneth Arrow, a good friend and former colleague of mine, once said his greatest social contribution was killing the idea of America investing in an SST, a supersonic transport, when he was on the staff of the Council of Economic Advisors. And of course, the British and French went ahead and did that, and eventually they abandoned the Concorde because it was just, it was subsidizing bankers flying from New York to London and not much else. And it never got environmental approval because it was too noisy and other things, and was commercially unavailable. So it was a beautiful plane. It was fun. I was able to take it a couple of times, but it made no sense. So his biggest social contribution was killing a bad idea. So I often say that a large part of the value added of good thinkers, including academics taking part-time out to serve in government, is preventing value subtracted, not just all trying to add value by good ideas.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then I'm curious as to, you mentioned like when you were, like when you talked to senators or policymakers on Capitol Hill, you mentioned like they're kind of like illusory, like they saw the markets as like this like illusory thing. And I'm like curious as to whether obviously you might not be as in close proximity with, people as you once were, but I'm curious whether or not you still think that perception amongst policymakers still exists today.
Yes, it does. But there's a certain hostility to markets. It used to be heavily on the political left, and still is, and probably the political left is moving further left these days to democratic socialism. There's a reason socialism has failed where it's been implemented, partly because markets don't work. I'll tell you a funny story about that if you're interested in when Bush sent me to help Gorby, we called Gorbachev Gorby in the White House, Gorby with economic reform. But that aside, um, now there's this view on the right that the government should be managing a lot more things. And I think that's a dangerous thing. There are certainly areas where it's important and maybe perhaps was neglected too much in the past, in national security, for example. We have to be alert to the geopolitical and military risks of China, not just our economic interactions, which can be positive, but also negative, and we have to manage that wisely. Um, but the idea that the government should be deciding what we should be spending where, who should be doing what where, um, you know, once we get outside the area of national security and reasonably broadly construed, because some of that's based on economic security, it's still important to appreciate that markets generally do a better job, that government often fails, and the notion that markets don't always work perfectly has to be compared to the notion that governments don't always either. So you have to have an idea of what's actually likely to be implemented in the real world, whether it's likely to improve things. And so I still feel pretty strongly that reliance primarily on markets, but there are areas where they don't do a very good job. And sometimes the government can do better and should be doing better. But you have to be on guard for the government failure being worse than the disease it's designed to cure.
Mm. And then, yeah, I think our next question gets at some of like your work more specifically on the CEA, and maybe you could share the Gorbachev story there. So you've chaired the Council of Economic Advisors during the H.W. Bush administration. So that was like amidst like the SNL crisis, the 1990 budget negotiations, and lots of stuff that followed the end of the Cold War. So this kind of, I guess, gets at some of what you were talking about earlier, but when economic analysis points in one direction, but again, political, I think you refer to it as like a sausage, political realities make that solution difficult. How do you kind of decide where compromise is responsible and where it becomes maybe counterproductive?
Well, first of all, you have to appreciate the political environment you're in.
Mm,
So George H.W. Bush, the 41st president of the United States, was elected with over 400 electoral votes, but the Democrats had huge majorities in the House and the Senate. H.W. was Republican. So, roughly speaking, Republicans had 175 House members and 43 senators. So, the president, unlike President Reagan when he first came in, had a majority in the Senate and a working majority on his economic program. Even though Democrats controlled the House, they had blue dog Democrats, conservative Democrats back then, who sided with the Republicans and helped pass some of that legislation. President George H.W. Bush did not have that luxury. So we were often batting down bad policies, but we still managed to do some good things, I think. And we expanded trade. We managed to put emissions trading in the Clean Air Act. I think we cleaned up a mess that had been brewing since the mid 1970s, and high inflation and deregulation of interest rates put the savings and loan industry basically in a large underwater category. And we'd also had the Mexican President de la Madrid repudiate Mexico's foreign debt. So the money center banks in New York, they since merged, but this was back when there was a Manny Hanny and a chemical bank, in addition to J.P. Morgan and a separate Chase, et cetera. And they were virtually all of them were mark to market insolvent. They had all these loans out, and they were trading when they could trade at 10 or 20 cents on the dollar. So we did Brady bonds to get a haircut and stretch out the payments and make that doable over time, and the Resolution Trust Corporation to deal with the S&Ls. Maybe there was a better way. I was put in charge of overseeing that, and when we finally got them to start marketing the failed S&L assets they acquired in bundles rather than one at a time, which would have taken 50 years to do. There was a big concern somebody might make money, if we package them all together. And I said, well, that's precisely what we're trying to do, is get them out there and get other people clean them up, right? That the government is going to be able to clean them up. And so I think on balance, those kind of worked. They were certainly not perfect, but on balance, they kind of worked. And I think George H.W. Bush handled the transition of after the fall of the Berlin Wall with really a deft hand. Um, Credit President Reagan's defense buildup and missile defense and standing up and saying, tear down this wall in Berlin, et cetera, were really vital to being able to have a post-Berlin Wall period. But Bush was careful. He could have beaten his chest and maybe scored some political points about that, but it would have made it much harder for Gorbachev, who was in the middle of political and economic reform, to do so. And so he shipped me off at one point to Moscow to help Gorby with economic reform and getting back to markets working. After meeting with him, I went to see the head of their statistics agency to find out what they thought they knew about the economy. And there are a lot of many stories here. I'll only tell you one. So I go see the head of Gosplan, the state planning agency, because back then everything was planned by central planners in Moscow. They figured how many women's shoes of what size would be produced and how many of those would be sent to Kiev and to Vladivostok and to St. Petersburg, et cetera. So kind of a very clumsy way to be allocating resources. You know, prior to that, Gorbachev had pounded the table and said, "We will bury you," claiming that um, claiming that they were outproducing us, but they were doing things like they were producing a lot of steel, making it into ball bearings, and when they didn't need all the ball bearings, they melted it back and made more steel. So it was a very inefficient economy that um, was really basically designed to try to boost their military capability and provided very little in the way of standard of living for Soviet citizens. Um, so I go see this guy, and the first question he asked me is, who sets the prices in your economy? Because he thinks I set the prices in America's economy because I'm Bush's chief economic advisor. Gorby's told him that. So I've won some teaching awards. So I say, well, we have a few regulated industries where there's a government commission that interacts with the firms and, has set some limits and et cetera. But mostly it's interaction of a lot of consumers and in some cases, many, in other cases, a smaller number of producers that sets the prices in our economy. So he keeps asking me who says this is through a translator. I've got my translator from the embassy as his from this is in the Kremlin, by the way. So it's really kind of a scary thing to think of how is this guy going to figure out how a market works. So I keep trying to explain, again, like I did to the senators, I try to explain how markets developed and how they interact and Adam Smith's invisible hand. Well, it's pretty clear he and also early on Gorbachev saw a market kind of like you're standing on the rim of the Grand Canyon jumping off without a parachute. They were very concerned about it all. And would this really work? So he finally gets very frustrated and he goes and brings out um, a 1960s, early 70s style flip chart with a Fortran output printed on it from a mainframe computer. It's the price list for the Soviet Union. He hands me a pen. He wants me to cross out their prices and write in the prices I think they should be. So, and then Gorby asked me to go on Soviet television to explain all this. So I call Bush and Jim Baker, our Secretary of State, and they figure out very quickly what I was worried about. Michael, it sounds like something that would be fun to do, but if you do this and something fails, we're going to be blamed. So lay off. So we decided not to do that. Later on, we had pressure to try to bail out Gorbachev and the Soviet economy, which again I got put in charge of, but I concluded it was kind of silly that the money would probably be stolen. We couldn't really tell whether it would wind up doing any good. So those are some fun stories, but you learn this in Economics 1 in high school or in freshman year or early on in college, and it makes a lot of sense. And you see it, and the business people see it every day in the real world. But some people are just not exposed to that, or they think they can do better. Remember, Marx and early Marx adherents in communist countries thought they were more scientific, and the market had all these flaws because, of course, it has some, and there are crises in capitalism at times, and it's blamed on capitalism, not on flaws in regulation or whatever it happens to be, or excessive speculation and what Alan Greenspan, who sadly passed away yesterday, called irrational exuberance at times. But in any event, on balance, the collective wisdom of many independent consumers and producers interacting in markets does better than um, the bureaucrats in the Kremlin or on Capitol Hill.
And then I think maybe we'll kind of revisit that point, maybe from like a civic kind of standpoint near the end of our interview. But I do kind of want to pivot to like another issue that was uh, I think that you focused a lot on during your kind of public service career. So you kind of created this commission, which is called today, like or known as today, called the Boskin Commission, which looked at the consumer price index, the CPI, and saw whether or not it was overstating inflation. And I think especially just like, since kind of like the turn of the decade, since like the pandemic and all that stuff, uh, conversations around inflation have become only more kind of necessary. And it just feels like the stakes of the commission are much more concrete. So just to kind of for our viewers, why does inflation measurement specifically matter so much for, ordinary households, government programs, and largely just like an understanding or the assessment of living standards within our country?
Well, first of all, many of our programs either are or they're being considered to be adjusted for inflation.
Mm,
Post-retirement Social Security benefits, um, the tax brackets, et cetera. Um, I was, as I mentioned, an advisor of President Reagan, and one of his reforms was to index the tax brackets for inflation to prevent people from being driven into higher tax rates purely by inflationary gains in their income. If inflation was 10% and your income went up 6%, but you went into a higher tax bracket, that was pretty damning. Since the early 80s, we've indexed the tax brackets. There are other aspects of the tax code we haven't. We haven't indexed capital gains for inflation or other things, or the measurement of depreciation. We do other things to account for that. We have lower rates, or we have accelerated depreciation, et cetera. So inventory accounting is another example. But in any event, there are many government programs tied to it. But most fundamentally, um, it's really helpful to have an accurate view of the economy as you can. And it's just not measuring inflation, because the inflation measures of inflation, not the CPI, it's the GDP deflator, which includes a personal consumption expenditure deflator, an investment deflator, government deflator, a government spending deflator, and an export and import prices deflators. But that really is affected by the measure of inflation. So get an idea of how much the economy is growing or contracting. Productivity growth has an inflation adjustment to it. So our most basic understanding of the economy is heavily driven by the measurement of prices. Most things we measure expenditure, which is a quantity times a price. So separating that out, and it becomes much more complicated in a world where the nature of goods is changing all the time, especially in a dynamic, flexible market economy. So if you go into a Walmart store and there's 60,000 separately priced items, over the course of the year, thousands disappear, thousands of new ones show up. Many thousands of the existing products have a new packaging that says they're new and improved. Some of that is they actually are more energy efficient, or they last longer or something. Others is they just, change the box to make it look like it's new. So how to separate out quality change and new goods and so on, which have particular characteristics. New goods tend to come in more highly priced, and their price falls as scale economies develop in their production, and so on. So there are many, many features of this. And of course, consumers adjust to changes in relative prices of goods. That's the first thing you learn in your microeconomics part of your introductory economics course. So if the price of one good goes up, if the price of chicken goes up, people may substitute hamburger or whatever. And so adjusting for that's called substitution bias. There's quality change bias. There's new good bias. There's also where people shop, when they shop. Okay. Um, Over time, it's become clear that a larger fraction of Christmas shopping is done after Christmas
mm,
because prices are lowered in sales after Christmas. Well, giving your kid a toy on January 1st as opposed to December 24th, is that really the same good? And at a lower price, or is it really slightly different? How do you measure all those things? And nowadays, of course, so our report addressed those things and concluded inflation was being overstated. Now, I have to emphasize, it wasn't that inflation was overstated when inflation got high, it wasn't overstated a lot more. It was the first one or a little over 1 percentage point was really not inflation. It was something else. Okay. It was not really a reflection of a true cost of living index. Um, so that's part one. Part two, we now have a lot of other things. There are a lot of things we get for free or purely for free. Okay. Um, but maybe you're exchanging your personal data for that free, allegedly free good.
Mhm.
So how should we think about that? Okay. Um, is that really free? Is it really that there's this chain exchange? You're dealing with all these ads. How should we price out, think about what the pure product is versus changes in the price of the pure product versus these other things. If increasingly you get more and more ads, okay, is the quality of the product deteriorating because it takes you more time to delete them, et cetera? To you know click on skip. So those are subtle issues, but clearly they become very important in our economy, and probably will become more important. Um, so that's kind of a new burst of interest in the measuring these things. Now that has gotten more attention because after a period of relatively low inflation in the sub 2% range, as the Fed had a 2% target, partly developed because they understood the first 1 percentage point or so in the measures was probably an overstatement. Um, uh, and then we had this big burst of inflation, which was heavily due to a huge increase in government spending as the economy approached full employment. At the end of the Trump administration, December, they included 600 billion of new spending that was probably unnecessary. And then in the beginning of the Biden administration, he had campaigned on a bunch of stuff. And, they called it the American Rescue Plan, but it actually worsened inflation. And that became 1.9 trillion or something. I forget the exact number. And the estimates were this combination was a multiple of the output gap between actual um, and potential GDP and was likely to be very inflationary. The Fed was also late in, as Chairman Powell admitted, in catching this as something that wasn't just transitory. Here's another issue. You talked about politicians don't understand something about economics. Economists often don't understand how average normal people and elected officials understand economic concepts. Okay. Transitory to economists is something that doesn't get permanently entrenched. It may take multiple quarters, 2 years to get rid of. Transitory to the average person means be gone in a month or a quarter. Okay. Um, Recession to economists is clearly defined. It's when the economy stops shrinking and starts growing again. Well, in 1982 or in the brief months in 2020 when we had the worst of COVID lockdowns, there's a sharp contraction. And when you start growing, unemployment's still really high. Okay. Um, to the average person, a recession's over when jobs are plentiful and their incomes are high again. Okay. So sometimes you have to appreciate that. Also, productivity is something economists spend a lot of time studying and believe is fundamental to living standards. And this, of course, is fundamental to what your generation is going to experience. Our productivity growth will be fundamental to that. But to many workers, it means their boss is going to make them work harder for less pay, for no more pay. Okay, so you've got to be careful how you think the signal you transmit is being received. You have to become savvy about that and understand there are ways to present technical economics points that are easier to understand. Milton Friedman, for example, rather than call what we call externalities in economics, pollution, congestion, which have effects that are outside the price system unless you add a fee or have some sort of permit required, et cetera. He often said it's better to call them neighborhood effects. People can understand that a little better. If you have a junkyard in your front yard, people understand that imposes costs on them. So
Yeah, I think that actually segues really well into, I think, what will be probably our last question. So you talked kind of a little bit about how lots of public communication from, economists or about, government programs or what's changing on like the macroeconomic landscape is not as effective as it can be. So I'm curious for one, as to what you think effective public communication looks like in that respect. And two, um, if there are any debates in specific that you think the public is still kind of not necessarily being given the fully sort of honest, or I should say clear kind of framing regarding.
Well, first of all, I think when you have a public policy, a proposal or some legislation, um, they often have lofty titles.
Mm,
Sometimes they're absurdly opposite for the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, if anything made inflation worse. But they were desperate because people were complaining about inflation. They wanted to pass basically a climate bill. They were desperate to make it saleable, so they called it the Inflation Reduction Act, which I think most people saw through. And you can't, people see what they're experiencing in the real world. Okay. And inflation is over, or bout of inflation is over when prices stop rising. So when inflation goes down from 9% to 5% to 3%, as it did later in the Biden administration, that's still inflation to people. There's still inflation, right? They don't understand we call disinflation a lower inflation rate, which we think is progress. Most people would say that their financial situation is still suffering because they're paying 3% higher prices on top of the 9 and 5% higher prices they paid the last 2 years. So it's important to get that across. But I always said that the way to explain these programs has to have three components. One is the background analysis of what it does to the overall economy. But the first thing is what it does to average people's budgets. For example, your average person's income will go up by $1,000 or $2,000 or whatever it may be, or go down by $500, but be worth it because you'll get this benefit. And the other is you have to give some specific examples because people have different ability, differential ability, their learning and their absorption capability, given time constraints, their educational backgrounds, whatever, their personal circumstances differ. So people can understand things at different levels. So I always thought it made sense to do all of that. Um,
well, thank you so much for taking.
and so I also say there's a back end to that question. What was it? What was the back end to your question? There were
Oh,
two.
the back end was just if there's kind of
Oh,
any specific
yeah.
debates that you think.
Yeah. I think something that's deeply unfortunate is that um, the Berlin Wall fell. Most socialist economies, for example, those of Eastern Europe, Poland, now the Czech Republic, but Czechoslovakia, um, uh, Hungary, etc., moved to different models.
Mm,
Now, it's exactly what we think of in the West as perfect. No, but they basically moved toward more market economies. And you saw how bad socialism had deprived people of living standards. If you compare North and South Korea, East and West Germany before the wall fell and the integration, um, it was just dramatically different. Uh, the standard of living of East Germans, in addition to all the totalitarian stuff they had to put up with and the secret police they had to put up with, was maybe a third of that of the West. And they both suffered similar things during the war. And um, we had one grow into an economic power and high standards of living and the strongest economy in Europe. The other struggled in the command economy framework. Um, so that's number one. And many other economies had moved away from the more socialist rubric. Britain under Margaret Thatcher and then back and forth. Tony Blair's New Labour was less socialist than the Labour Party had been, for example. And I could go on and on. But because many young people have no experience and some of their parents have no direct experience, they just, it was recently going on when they were in school, for example. Um, I think that a large part of the public, particularly younger people, and polls show the big difference between Democrats and Republicans. Maybe that's why some are Democrats, others are Republicans. They seem to have no understanding of the the difficulties that socialism has in providing reasonable living standards, in addition to the suppression of economic freedom and the usurpation of individual responsibility and initiative, which are, in my view, really undermining of a strong capitalist, mixed capitalist democracy. Um, but just how difficult it is to have socialist institutions deliver efficiently and effectively and without massive subsidies that become crushingly expensive. I think that's the biggest challenge we face right now, and I think it revolves around um, probably not for you guys at your exalted school, but for many kids, they've been um, sold an exaggerated negative impression of capitalism and an exaggerated positive impression of socialism.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Boskin, for joining us today.
You're welcome, Jonah. Take care. Good to be with you. Bye bye.